Right, so today we're going to talk about semicolons. And semicolons are a sophisticated little piece of grammar that's worth knowing how to use. And one of the ways to think about a semicolon is that it serves to perhaps break up the monotony of the sort of constant comma coordinating conjunction sentence structure. You know, we find that you advance from making short sentences like I went to the mall, I bought shoes, I came home, which we recognize as sounding sort of choppy and robotic, to things like I went to the mall and I bought shoes. Oops. Then I came home, but I didn't stay long. Something like that, right? We start to create our sentences and combine them using the comma coordinating conjunction combination that makes sentences just flow a little bit better. But even still, after a while, that can become just as tedious. And so you may discover that you want to do something to break up that over and over comma coordinating conjunction. And that's where a semicolon can come into play. Once again, very much like with comma and coordinating conjunction, the rule is if you have two independent clauses, you can combine them with a semicolon as long as they are closely related. And that's an important statement, but generally if you've gotten to a point where you're thinking about using semicolons in your writing, more than likely you're not going to have two sentences next to each other that just have nothing to do with each other. So that's an important caveat, but more likely than not, they'll be closely related, closely related enough to each other. So if we look at our first two sentence examples here. I went to the mall, I bought shoes. You could do I went to the mall and I bought shoes. Or you could say I went to the mall, I bought shoes. And combine them like that, right? And that would be a pretty common use for a semicolon. Now, that being said, semicolons are rare pieces of grammar. They're not punctuation that you just sort of throw about. So one of the things to think about when you use a semicolon is you want to make sure that the semicolon use has a purpose. Make sure there's a purpose behind your use of a semicolon. And by that I mean you shouldn't just go through and start changing every comma and coordinating conjunction into a semicolon, because then you're going back to sort of this look where you create a monotony, almost a plodding sort of subject verb predicate subject verb predicate subject verb predicate after one after another. A sophisticated use of a semicolon. I don't know what I just did there. Use of a semicolon is when you use transitional phrases or words. So you might find that you have a statement like, I went to the mall, I didn't buy any shoes, right? And you want to combine these, and you could certainly do, I went to the mall, but I didn't buy any shoes. Or, I went to the mall, I didn't buy any shoes. But another thing you might think about is to use a transitional word, which might be something like, I went to the mall, however, I didn't buy any shoes. And what's really nice about transitional words and phrases, and we'll talk about those in particular in another video, but what's useful about them is that they create a nice flow to your writing, and they help a reader get a sense of what direction are we heading in. Are we continuing in a positive direction? Are we shifting tacks, right? Therefore sort of gives you a sense of continuing on and resolution, whereas however gives you a sense of reversal, that we're going to go in a different direction. And those little cues for your reader can be really useful while also creating this lovely logical flow. But when you want to combine sentences like this using a transitional phrase, what you do is you have a semicolon here and a comma here. And if you go back and remember what the point is about this, right, and what the point is about this, which is you have to have two independent clauses before you can use a semicolon. What you realize is if you put however here in the middle, you still have your independent sentence, independent clause, and independent clause, right? And therefore, to combine them, you either have to have just the semicolon or a comma and a coordinating conjunction. But however isn't a coordinating conjunction. So you have to use the semicolon first off to split the two sentences. And then however becomes an introductory phrase on its own that requires a comma after it if you think about comma rule number 2. So you're actually combining a bunch of comma rules here. First, you're considering the two independent clause function of using a semicolon, and then you're considering the introductory phrase rule of comma rule number 2. So when you want to use a transitional phrase in this way, word or phrase, you semicolon to indicate a split between the two independent clauses, and then a comma afterwards to indicate the dependent phrase. The reason you need to pay attention to this word choice and recognizing that it's a transitional phrase between two independent clauses is that we sometimes use those sorts of words differently. For instance, you might have a sentence like, "The boys, however, eventually took notes." All right? Here, you don't have an independent clause on both sides. You're not going from one statement and transitioning to another statement. You're all in one sentence. So here, you can't put a semicolon here because this isn't an independent clause, and this certainly isn't an independent clause. Here, you would just bracket this word with your commas, because in fact, this is comma rule number 3, which is that this is a non-essential word or phrase, right? The boys eventually took notes is the core of your sentence, and however becomes non-essential, and so you bracket it in commas. So much like when in rule number 1, where when you see a coordinating conjunction, you have to stop and ask yourself, do I have independent clauses on both sides? Similarly, when you see a transitional word, you need to stop and make sure, is it a transitional word, or am I simply using it as a non-essential addition to my sentence? But those are the rules for a semicolon. You can use it to combine two independent clauses as long as they are closely related. And they're a nice, sophisticated piece of punctuation when you use them with a transitional word or phrase.